So if you want to know how to make money for your podcast through Patreon or another crowdfunding source, stay tuned. So Colby, let's kick things off. What exactly is Patreon?
Patreon is a platform where creators can provide exclusive content to their fans in exchange for a monthly membership. It's based on the old concept of patronage.
So how could like a podcaster use something like Patreon in order to monetize their podcast?
Yeah, so I've seen two primary ways. There's probably more, but one of them is to have a secret podcast, and that's a podcast that you exclusively put out on Patreon, and then it gives a secret RSS feed to each individual member. And then the second way is to take your episode that you distribute to all the hosting platforms and directories and share that episode, and then you just save the last 15 or 30 minutes of the episode exclusively for Patreon.
That makes sense. So, I mean, it sounds like it could be difficult to set up. Is it hard to create an account?
The initial setup is super simple. I think the thing to consider is just planning for the long term. I was at a panel about monetizing through Patreon and platforms like that in Podcast Movement last week. And one of the key things that kept coming up was just the challenge of long-term extra content creation. Since it's about creating exclusive content on top of the stuff you already make, coming up with a clear strategy at the beginning when you're setting everything up is really important to make sure that 6 months down the road, you don't burn out.
Last question, does something like this actually work?
So the benefit of Patreon is that the barrier to entry is super low. So whereas the CPI for having an advertisement is 1,000 downloads, it's kind of like the first tier. But with Patreon, you can start it with 1 subscriber. I mean, there's no real minimums. You can only grow from there. So as a concrete example, let's say you have a $5 membership tier as your starting point for exclusive content. So $5 a month and you only have 100 subscribers. But that's literally $500 just from 100 fans. And so I think that shows the importance of quality over quantity. And that's one of the benefits is some shows have a small listener base because they're a niche, but they actually have really loyal fans. And so that's one of the benefits of Patreon. I mean, if you're a podcast that has 50,000 downloads per episode, you might not need to do Patreon. I mean, maybe it's good for you, but you could get some solid money from ads with those kind of numbers. So I think it just depends on your strategy and what kind of podcast you are.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, so obviously Patreon and crowdfunding is just one strategy for monetizing your podcast, but appreciate Colby giving some insight into how you can think through whether or not it might make sense for you. Until next time.